Welcome back to American History 2, History 122. In this section, we're going to stick with the last 30 or so years of the 19th century. But we're going to shift our thematic focus away from the post-Civil War South, the plight of African people within the United States, and move toward a different theme, industrialization. Now, beginning with industrialization in roughly 1870 or so, is often kind of a funny thing. It's kind of like starting in the middle of the story because the first mechanized equipment being used to manufacture textiles in the U.S. Was actually created way back in 1791. But there is a certain rapidity to the amount of change taking place after the Civil War, which warrants a discussion of what's taking place in this period. As the slide in front of you indicates, in 1870, most Americans were still employed in agriculture. Over half of Americans were agriculturalists, and about a quarter were employed in manufacturing. But you can see by 1920, those numbers have flip-flopped. Only 27% of Americans were then employed in agriculture, and 40% were employed in manufacturing or transportation. So a fairly dramatic change in the kind of ways Americans are living, the way Americans are making products. All of these things are undergoing dramatic change in the last 30 or so years of the 19th century that result in a very different America by 1920. And for many years, historians suggested that in this era that they often refer to as the Gilded Age, gilded because of the immense wealth for a handful of individuals that is created through this process of industrialization, the U.S. government stood by idly and did not intervene in the economy. But in more recent years, historians are beginning to recognize the number of tangible and direct ways in which the U.S. government was intentionally shaping the economy that was developing in the last 30 years of the 19th century. On the slide in front of you are some of the ways in which the federal government takes an active role in shaping the economy and trying to encourage industrialization after the Civil War. During the Civil War, the U.S. created the first paper currency in American history called the greenbacks in the Currency Act of 1862. After the Civil War, the nation, however, returns to the gold standard, where gold is considered the only real hard money in the United States. Now, the reason the U.S. government does that, or I should say the part of the reason the U.S. government does that, reason Congress decides to move away from paper money, is to try and encourage foreign investors to invest in American businesses. The fear was that as long as America had a paper money supply, foreign investors were going to be anxious about buying American stock because with paper money, you can just print more of it. So if you have a paper money supply, what's to prevent the U.S. government from simply printing off $50 million more dollars in order to meet their expense needs? Foreign creditors might worry that if they bought stock in U.S. companies and the U.S. engaged in policies that would be creating hyperinflation, they would see their investments ruined in just a year. And so perhaps foreign investors wouldn't want to buy into a market where there is paper money. So Congress decides in order to encourage foreign stock buyers to buy American stock in American companies, they're going to have to move to the gold standard in order to encourage those investments. There are also a number of protective tariffs on the books throughout the late 19th century. Protective tariffs are taxes on foreign products that are so high that Americans are encouraged to buy domestically produced items instead. Now that is, again, an example of an active step that the U.S. government is taking in order to encourage industrial growth in the late 19th century. There are certainly plenty of economists and plenty of congressmen who are opposed to these protective tariffs. The issue of the protective tariff is going to be the one issue that tends to often divide Republicans and Democrats in national elections in the 19th century, post-Civil War period. But the reality was that they were on the books, that these things exist, they're active, they are in fact being enforced, and it's an active way in which the national government is shaping the economy that is developing in this period. And then we're also going to see that when it comes to the construction of railroads, the U.S. government is taking an active role in ensuring the creation of this infrastructure. Railroads will prove incredibly important when it comes to creating industrial production. Unless there's a transportation network in place that allows industrial producers to send their goods to a very large marketplace, it's impossible for industrialists to get started. If they've got a limited market, a limited number of people who can actually buy their products, it tends to discourage industrial production. But with the creation of a sufficient infrastructure that allows for the relatively easy transportation of goods across the entire continent, then industrial producers can work on the premise that they have a large population of people to sell to. Now, one way in which the U.S. government encourages the growth of railroads and other industrial development in the period is by making it fairly easy for businesses to incorporate. Incorporation charters had been issued since the very earliest days of the United States. Some of the earliest issuances of incorporation charters were issued to religious organizations. Religious organizations often incorporate so that no single individual owns the property, but it belongs to the corporate whole and not to any single individual. But in the early 19th century, state governments which issued these incorporation charters tended to insist that if there was a business that was going to be incorporated, it had to serve some sort of public purpose. So if you're going to build a canal or you're going to run a ferry service, often these proposals for running such businesses also indicated how it was that they were going to benefit the public, make transportation costs cheaper for residents living in a place, allow for businesses to expand because of the increased availability of shipping. There had to be some sort of public component to it. But what we tend to see after the Civil War is it becomes incredibly easy for businesses to gain incorporation charters, and state governments were simply giving them away like toilet paper. Now, there are a number of things that incorporation charters allow businesses to do, which are incredibly important for really expensive enterprises like building a railroad. One is that it allows businesses to pool vast sums of money together. Building a railroad is expensive. There's a lot of money that goes into it before the first dollar is made in shipping goods. And the way you pool that money together is by getting a bunch of stock buyers to invest in your company. Each holder of a piece of stock is a part owner, and they are putting their money into the company. So this allows businesses to raise a lot more money than if they are run by a single proprietor, a single individual using his or her own finances to start up the business. Incorporation charters also offer this very big bonus, which is limited liability. If you invest in stock, so if you have a 401k today and part of your retirement plan is in stock, you're not risking all of your finances by buying stock. So if that business should go bankrupt and the stock becomes worthless, creditors who are trying to recover the business's debts are not going to come to you personally and say you owe another $1,000 because this business was insolvent. You're only risking the money that you invest. So it's different than a single proprietorship. If you go to a bank, ask for a loan to open up a coffee shop, and it's on your personal finances, you're on the hook. If your coffee shop closes and you still owe money after selling all of its property, you could lose your car, you could lose your home, but a limited liability company allows investors to risk their money and gamble that this business will be successful, but not at the same time also risk their personal finances. And again, this is something that can only exist because state governments allow for these incorporation charters to exist. Incorporation charters don't just exist naturally in the world, they exist because governments are there to create them. And the U.S. government is also going to extend benefits to railroads, building in places where there are not a whole lot of people. On the map in front of you is a map of the United States and the various railroad lines that existed before the Civil War and after the Civil War. All the green lines were lines that existed or were in operation by 1870. All the red lines are new lines that are created after 1870 and before 1890. So you can see it's a dramatic expansion of rail transit around the country in the span of 20 years. And you'll notice that most of the expansion is in areas we would call the West and probably the South too. Certainly there were a lot of railroad lines in the South, but many of these red lines are also there as well. Particularly in places in the West, these areas where railroad lines are being constructed are areas where there were not a whole lot of people. And generally, railroad companies are reluctant to build where the people aren't. That's how they make their profits. People buy passenger tickets. They pay to have the goods they're producing to be shipped on these railroads. And so railroads realize if they build where there are not a lot of people, then they're not going to get a lot of profit. The problem for the U.S. government, though, is that it's in the national interest that railroads build these lines. But that's the problem of using private businesses to satisfy a public interest of some kind. Private businesses have very different interests. They want to benefit their stockholders. They want to bring profits to their stockholders. They're not interested in expanding the national infrastructure for the benefit of the nation as a whole. That's not one of their motivational factors. So there are various things the U.S. government's going to have to do in order to make it in the interest of railroads to build in places where there were not a lot of people, including land grants. The national government also gave a number of railroad companies deals on government bonds, but land grants become one of the more important ways in which the U.S. government incentivizes the construction of railroads in a lot of places, particularly out west. So the U.S. government is one of the biggest holders of property out west, and a lot of this property is given away to railroads in exchange for their willingness to build in places where the U.S. government does not see a whole lot of infrastructure. Now, the growth of this infrastructure, these railroad lines across the country, are going to allow for monopolization in other industries because now businesses are interconnected with one another. A company in New York can ship their products across the country in a relatively short period of time, and businesses will try to outdo each other in their operations. Now, there are a number of examples we can point to where businesses that are producing items for sale across the country are able to engage in what we might call economies of scale in order to outproduce smaller competitors. One example of a business taking advantage of this new integrated infrastructure of the railroads is going to be this McCormick's company. McCormick's had been producing at this period something called the reaper. The reaper was a harvesting device that allowed farmers to harvest their wheat. You can see on the slide in front of you an artist's depiction of what the reaper does. And what happens is in 1880, McCormick's hires a former employee of the Colt gun manufacturing company. Colt had been using interchangeable parts for some time to speed up production, and that's exactly what McCormick's does. He takes the principles he learned at Colt, creates casts for manufacturing parts for these reapers in relatively quick manner, and McCormick's is able to dramatically increase the scale of production. In 1880, they produced 21,000 machines, and in 1889, they're producing over 100,000 machines in a single year. So they're able to dramatically scale up production, and the only reason that would make sense is if they can send these reapers across the country. They're not just selling for a local market in the vicinity of Illinois or Michigan. They're selling to farmers across the entire United States. Another example of how the railroads will allow for these growing industries is going to be in the meatpacking industry. If you think about the nature of meat processing, it's often, by its very nature, a very localized industry. Meat is going to spoil fairly quickly unless you can ship it to market relatively quickly in some sort of refrigerated unit. Creating refrigerated rail cars was actually a bit more of a complicated process than we might think. Having these big sheets of ice that allowed the interior to be cool tended to make the railroad cars top-heavy, they tended to wobble, they were often dangerous. But in 1878, Gustavus Swift hires some individuals who allowed the Swift meat processing company to develop the first really viable version of a refrigerated rail car. And this allows the Swift company to ship their meat across the country. And we'll see going forward, and your readings from After the Fact are going to talk about this too, but By taking advantage of this railroad infrastructure, Swift is able to often outcompete a lot of his smaller competitors in local markets. If you think about producing meat on a massive scale, a lot of the trash that smaller butchers are going to produce, things like bones, smaller producers have to pay someone to haul that stuff away. Larger producers like Swift, because they're working on such an enormous scale, can take those waste products and turn it into something profitable for themselves. What Swift did was grind up those bones, turn them into fertilizer, and sell them back to farmers. And using the profits from the bone fertilizer, Swift is able to cut the prices of his meat and sell it for less than many of his smaller competitors and drive many of them out of business. On the slide in front of you is a political cartoon that was drawn in the late 19th century. The late 19th century is really the sort of classic era of political cartoons. One of the most famous political cartoonists is Thomas Nast. He gave us the modern image of what we think of as Santa Claus today. The picture in front of you is not by Thomas Nast. It's another artist. It was published in an English newspaper. But it's a picture of an American who made a killing in this new industrial era. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who's depicted on the cartoon in front of you, made a lot of money for himself investing in the railroad industry. By the late 19th century, he was president of the New York Central, but earlier in life, he had been investing in steamboats. And by the 1830s, he could tell that steamboats were becoming old news, and then all the new money was going to be made by railroads. And so he took his money out of steamboats and put it in the railroads. And by the late 19th century, he was controlling interest in lots of different companies, particularly the New York Central. And as this slide indicates, and the cartoonist who drew this picture wants to indicate to you, these vast sums of money that are being generated in these new corporations are creating not just lots of money, but lots of power. Cornelius Vanderbilt here is portrayed as somebody who translates all this money into a lot of authority in the world around him. It's hard to see on the slide in front of you, but the little sign that's underneath his feet here is emphasizing that anybody who wants to send rail goods to the Atlantic coast has to pay a fee to this giant person here, this Leviathan who controls the rail transit as a giant puppet master along the East Coast. Now, this is a real shock for many Americans who had long believed that this was a republic in which one vote meant one share of power over the national government. But what you have here in the late 19th century is this new economic reality in which vast quantities of money are being generated in this industrial production. And it's suggesting maybe that's not true anymore. Maybe, in fact, some people have a bigger share of power over the national government, not just one vote, but maybe they still only have one vote. But now, because of this vast sum of money they actually have more power over the national government. And there are some groups and individuals for whom this period of industrialization is experienced as a loss of their independence, as a loss of the kind of money they expected to make for themselves, particularly individuals involved in what we might call the traditional crafts. There was a time in American history in the late 18th century and into the 19th century when everything that you can imagine was being made by either an apprentice, a journeyman, or a master craftsman. Typically, in order to learn how to make something like a shoe, or to become a joiner, somebody who makes furniture, or a carpenter, somebody who's more in woodworking for the house, you had to be enlisted as an apprentice. For some of the really expensive trades where a master craftsman could expect to make a lot of money, parents would have to pay a pretty considerable fee to have their children apprenticed out. For some of the other trades like shoemaking, in which master craftsmen simply did not make a whole lot of money, the apprenticeships were often free. What that meant is that you'd send your young boy off, typically early teens. That young boy would work for a master craftsman as an apprentice for a period of about 7 years or so. Typically, the contracts parents signed indicated that the master craftsman would teach that apprentice the art and mystery of that particular craft, whether it's shoemaking or being a silversmith, which would be a very expensive craft to be able to master. And at the end of that 7-year term, presumably this young boy who's now in his 20s would know the whole process of production and would essentially be graduating out of his apprenticeship. And once he graduated, he became a journeyman. He's no longer living with the master. He's no longer working for the master in exchange for all this education he's getting. And now he's on his own working for wages. And a journeyman works for wages for a period of time until he saves up enough money to buy his own shop. And then he becomes a master craftsman, can open up his own shop, and take on apprentices himself. And the whole cycle begins anew. Well, the problem for many of these master craftsmen and journeymen is that it becomes harder and harder for them to survive. A small shop employing 5 apprentices, a couple of journeymen, and a master craftsman simply cannot compete quite often with some of these bigger firms that are producing on such a massive scale that they're able to sell each unit for less than what a master craftsman can sell it for. And so some of these master craftsmen are going out of business. What we see in cities like New York over the course of the 19th century is that the average age of journeymen in the city tends to just go up. So that by the time we get to the 1830s or 1840s, the average age of a journeyman's entering his 40s. Now what that's indicating is that these journeymen are entering a class of permanent wage laborers. That in theory, this was supposed to be a temporary life stage where they worked for wages for a period of time until they saved up enough money to buy their own shop. But the increasing reality by the Civil War, and certainly after the Civil War, is that a lot of these journeymen are becoming permanent wage laborers, never able to save up enough money to be able to buy their own shop and engage in production. Now, some of these people managed to make this transition to this new industrial process fine. Some master craftsmen simply dramatically enlarged their shops. Instead of just having a handful of workers who live with them and they work and they live in the same facility, what increasingly happens is some of these shops will just get enormous. Instead of having just 5 apprentices, they'll have 90 or 100 apprentices. The master craftsman will move out of the shop and have a home somewhere else. Other craftsmen, however, don't make this transition very well. Some of them feel as though they're being pushed down into the untrained labor pool, and all of this education, all of this work they'd put into learning the art and mystery of this particular craft, all of this is becoming less and less valuable, and they feel like they've wasted their time. Some journeymen as well are able to make the transition from being a journeyman craftsman to being what we might call a manager. You can imagine in a shop floor with just a handful of apprentices, you don't need a lot of people to direct the labor of the apprentices, just the master craftsman. But when that shop floor increases to 90, 100 apprentices, now it behooves the master craftsman to hire some people whose job it is specifically to make sure everybody is staying on task and doing the job that's been given to them. We don't often think of the late 19th century as a particularly violent period in American history, but a lot of the frustration that was felt by workers who were discovering that the kind of livelihood that they expected was just not going to be available, frustration about being cast down into a pool of unskilled laborers when they thought that they had been trained for some skilled craft. A lot of this anger spilled over into a number of really quite bloody and violent labor unrest towards the end of the 19th century. One of the biggest examples of this is the Great Railroad Strike of 1877. What ended up happening is railroad stock actually precipitated that crisis in 1873, known as the Panic of 1873. The Panic of 1873 creates something of a depression, so unemployment gets higher, and some railroad companies found it hard to stay open. And the B&O Railroad announced to their workers in a less than friendly way that they were planning to cut the salaries of lots of their employees. Rather than accept that, the workers went on strike, and lots of railroad workers around the country who were also members of the same union went on strike as well. The net result is that rail traffic east of the Mississippi basically ground to a halt as they couldn't find workers they could find workers. The workers who had been staffing it went on strike, and often they engaged in various forms of violence to try and prevent the railroad companies from hiring what become known as scabs, people who are hired specifically to try and break the strike so that the operations remain open, even though most of the previous employees are now striking. So lots of violence. A lot of these companies called out police departments to try and keep their rail lines open. But a lot of the police departments responded by saying, well, look, a lot of our friends are among the strikers. Maybe they're friends or relatives. So police departments often proved unwilling to fire into the crowds of striking workers. And so a lot of these companies end up calling out the state militias, and eventually the national government got involved too. By the time the strike was finally broken, over 100 people had been killed, tens of millions of dollars worth of property had been destroyed, and it became one of the most violent and unsettling strikes of the period, but by no means a lone example. There were quite a few strikes, if not in similar scale, often of similar ferocity. Another one of the really glaring examples of a bloody strike is going to be the Homestead strikes of 1892. A similar problem. The workers at Carnegie Steel didn't like their wages and their hours. They went on strike, and they basically besieged themselves into the steelworks and refused to allow anybody in. The result was a virtual battle between the workers at Carnegie Steel and a private security force that Carnegie had hired, known as the Pinkertons, to try and open up the factory. A lot of the Pinkertons were captured. Many of them were beaten up and abused. There ended up being a congressional hearing afterwards to look into the matter. So lots of examples like that. I mean, basically battles on the streets over whether these factories are going to stay closed, whether they're open, between strikers and sometimes state governments and sometimes the national government as well, getting involved in trying to keep these factories open. So it's really in the period after the Civil War where we see the rise of modern labor unions. Prior to the Civil War, there were guilds, which were basically alliances of people engaged in the same craft. So there'd be like a shoemaker's guild or a blacksmith's guild. But after the Civil War, a lot of these guilds started to transform into organizations more broadly designed to represent the interests of workers within their craft, particularly against some of these new industrially scaled productions of whatever product it is that they had been making. One of the more infamous labor unions in this period that had rather grandiose vision of what they wanted to accomplish was the Knights of Labor. The Knights of Labor, one, take in lots of different workers, so they're not bound by one particular craft, but they're representing workers in lots of different crafts. In some places, actually, the Knights of Labor sort of bridge this divide between being a labor union and a political party. In some places of North Carolina, the Knights of Labor created a black and white fusion ticket that sometimes won local elections. So the Knights of Labor have a fairly grand vision of what they want to accomplish. They identify the primary problem here as having been the way in which labor had been organized, the control of property that had been dominated by the factory owners. This political cartoon on the slide in front of you gives you a sense of how they tended to view the world, that you have all these people at the top who are skimming off all the labor that is actually being performed by the people at the bottom. And the people at the bottom are getting very little of the fruits of their own labor, and instead most of the benefits are going to other people. So the Knights of Labor wanted nothing less than a reversion of the way in which labor was done, who controlled the property. Other labor organizations, like the American Federation of Labor, which was partially founded by Samuel Gompers, he's become rather famous within the labor tradition. He testifies in front of Congress on several occasions. The AFL could be just as strict on their positions. I don't want to give you the sense that they were less committed to labor issues, but they tended to have maybe smaller goals, more tangible goals. So instead of wanting to completely change the way in which labor was being performed, they wanted a bigger share of the pie. So maybe an increase in wages, or a decrease in the hours per day expected of workers, or perhaps better worker safety conditions. So they tended to have smaller, more tangible goals and less of a grandiose vision of fundamentally changing the way in which labor was being performed at this point. Now, another bloody strike is going to forever damage and eventually destroy the Knights of Labor as an organization. What happened is in 1886, the McCormick's reaper plant that was making these wheat harvesting devices, the workers there went on strike. And on May 1st, they were marching when several of their number had been killed by the police. The next day, you can understand a lot of the workers were rip-roaring mad about this, and so they showed up to protest. And while they were protesting, the police showed up. At some point, somebody threw a bomb, and seven of the police officers ended up being killed. And there was public outcry for something to be done here. Eventually, 8 anarchists within the movement were arrested. The evidence against them was pretty flimsy. 4 of them are going to be hanged. 1 commits suicide rather than be executed in prison. And it forever destroys the reputation of the Knights of Labor. After this event, they became unswervingly labeled as a dangerously radical movement. So all of that indicates that, yes, there are certainly lots of people who are very anxious and angry about these economic changes taking place in the late 19th century. But there are also quite a few people who think that this change in the way that things are being produced is fundamentally a good thing. One of them is a novelist by the name of Horatio Alger. You might profitably think of him as something like the J.K. Rowling of his day. He wrote novels intended for young boys. They were not really intended for girls, but for boys. A lot of these novels had this basic same sort of storyline. They had different characters, but they all followed a fairly similar pattern, where you'd have a young boy in his teens. This is why it appeals to a younger audience. And he's living on the streets. He's struggling to survive. He's working odd jobs, but he's often wasting his money on things that don't really matter. And then at some point in the novel, he'll bump into a more successful, wealthy businessman. And this businessman will take this young boy under his wing, teach him good morals, how to use his money appropriately and not waste it. He'll teach him the value of an education and hard work. And by the end of the novel, the young boy is usually an intern in an accounting office or moving up in the world, and clearly going to be moving out of his lifestyle that really wasn't going anywhere and moving towards something that's going to really provide him with a future. So as these novels tended to suggest, and as many people bought into in this period, hard work, thrift, and education, all of this stuff allowed you to be successful, and tended to suggest if you didn't have these things, then you weren't successful. So the often suggestion was, if you're poor and you're struggling and you're not able to make it, then it's probably something that's wrong with you rather than with the world around you. There's a whole philosophy of economics that pops up in this period known as social Darwinism. The name social Darwinism comes from the writing of Charles Darwin, the person who came up with the theory of natural selection to understand where species come from and how new species are created. Well, this British philosopher, economist named Herbert Spencer takes those ideas of Charles Darwin and uses them to try and apply them to the human condition. And what he says is that in the economic world, people who don't have good ideas, who don't work hard, who are lazy, who fail to have some sense of initiative, they're not going to be successful. And the suggestion is that they should be allowed to be unsuccessful, because if you fiddle with the system and you make it so that these people who aren't as good as others can be successful, you're going to make a less efficient system. You're going to fundamentally change the natural order of things. It's just natural that some people will fail and others will be successful. This kind of thinking, this social Darwinism, is going to inspire a broader kind of thinking called laissez-faire. And laissez-faire is just a fancy French phrase that means hands-off. And the suggestion of social Darwinists was that the government ought to keep its hands off of the economy, that whenever the government got involved, it just messed things up and created inequalities, an unfair system, and tended to discourage efficiency. So for Herbert Spencer and others, you're going to be reading about one of these individuals this week. This kind of philosophy suggests the government will just mess things up if it tinkers with the economy, and it ought to just let the natural order of things progress as it would without some sort of interference. Now, again, for many years, historians assumed that this late 19th century period, sometimes referred to as the Gilded Age, government policy actually was a laissez-faire policy, but as we've already seen, in a lot of ways, the national government, state governments are directly shaping how this economy is going to develop. But there are certainly a lot of people in Congress, a lot of economists who buy into these theories and feel as though the national government should keep its hands off of the economy. You're also going to be reading a document from Andrew Carnegie this week on his reflections in the economy. And you'll see that he's not quite a laissez-faire economist. He thinks that there is some role to play, that there are some obligations that wealthy people have to poorer people. For many years leading up to the Homestead strikes in 1892, he was sort of known as a more friendly person towards the working class. The Homestead strikes will forever tarnish that reputation, but your reading will indicate why at least some members of the working class regarded Carnegie as somebody who wasn't indifferent to the concerns of the working poor. Carnegie himself really did have a sort of rags to riches story, like he was the protagonist in some Horatio Alger novel or something. He came from Scotland with nothing, and by the end of the 19th century, he's one of the richest men in America, having made a lot of money in the steel refining business. So certainly this period is fundamentally changing the way in which Americans worked, but it's also changing the way in which Americans shopped. If you look at newspaper advertisements in the very early part of the 19th century, they're pretty basic. You'll often see a clip in a newspaper that will say, so-and-so just got a shipment of Windsor chairs from overseas. If you're interested, go see him. Well, there's a lot of assumed knowledge there. It assumes you know who this person is and already know how to contact him. You know where he lives, because a lot of communities were pretty small, and people did know where to go. But now what we're seeing is that the person who made this thing is going to be very far removed from the place where the thing is being purchased. You don't have to have manufacturers in every city making items for the consumer population. You can have it being centrally produced in one place and then shipped out across the country and sold in lots of different places. So what you start to see in the late 19th century, the development of modern department stores, a place where you can go and you don't have to go to every single manufacturer. You don't have to go to the hatter for a hat and a dressmaker for a dress. You can just go to the department store and buy lots of different things that you might need for your household. This is a picture of the Wanamaker department store in Philadelphia. It was a sort of standalone store. It was not a chain. There will be some chains like Woolworths that will develop in this period as well. A lot of these department stores, like Wanamaker's, wanted to make Americans feel as though they were not just buying stuff, but buying a lifestyle. So you'd go in there, and they would wine and dine you. They'd often have restaurants that prided themselves on providing fine cuisine because they wanted to make you feel as though you were entering a new social class in the process of going shopping. Wanamaker's was rather famous for this big organ that they had musicians play to sort of give it a sort of sacred atmosphere and certainly a refined atmosphere. I understand today that organ is being restored. But yeah, so Americans actually go to stores that are specifically designed for shopping. They don't go to the manufacturer or the merchant anymore to go buy these things. So what we're tending to see is a greater separation between home life, work life, and shopping life. All of these processes are now taking place at different facilities, whereas at the beginning of the 19th century, quite often it was the same building that served as home, as storefront, and as manufacturing site. The hatter lived in the place where he worked. He made hats there, and often he sold to customers out of the shop where he made hats. What this also means is that you're going to have some new employees, some new kinds of workers that are being created in this era of industrialization. And the realization that some new jobs are coming into existence that hadn't existed before helps us give us some sense why some people at least felt as though this process of industrialization maybe wasn't such a bad thing. If you successfully make the transition from journeyman to manager on a shop floor, you might not think this is such a terrible process. If you take advantage of these new department stores and become a retail store manager, a retail clerk, maybe you don't think these changes are so bad either. These jobs simply didn't exist before, and now all of a sudden, now that we have centralized production of stuff and it's being sent out across the country, you have a need for these retail employees. This is also the era in which modern advertising is born. If you think about buying things before, you were buying them directly from the person who made it, and you often relied on the reputation of that manufacturer. But if that manufacturer lives hundreds of miles away, you don't know what they're like, you can't visit the shop where they're producing things, you certainly don't know the names of the people who made it. So you have to figure out other ways to convince customers to buy your product and not your competitor's product. And this is where marketing steps in. On the slide in front of you is a picture of an early Kodak advertisement. Kodak film was quite revolutionary in changing the way in which pictures were taken. Prior to Kodak, you basically had to have a whole wagon full of equipment to be able to take a picture. But Kodak's slogan became, you take the picture, we'll take care of the rest. You could buy a Kodak camera, pre-filled with film, and then once you were done taking pictures, you take it back to the store, they'd develop it for you, and then they'd give you the pictures. So because of the rise of mass production at centralized locations around the country, you have to have some people out there whose job it is specifically to convince customers to buy this product and not another product. So you see lots of jobs being created, even as you see some jobs being destroyed in this period. The rise of advertisers, retail clerks, as well as shop floor managers. This is also the period in which you see the rise of sort of characters associated with products. You know, it's an attempt in some ways to try and maintain some of that personal connection you might have with a product prior to this era of industrialization. So think people like the Quaker Oats guy, for example. The Quaker Oats guy has a nice warm impression about it. He's obviously a made-up person. He does not actually exist, but it in theory helps customers connect with the product as if he is real, as if you're buying it from someone who actually is the Quaker Oats guy, so that you are more inclined to buy that product. Now, in the late 19th century, after the end of Reconstruction, the two political parties are pretty evenly divided as far as their political support is concerned. The reality is that for most of this period, Republicans tended to dominate, but elections tended to be very close. The only Democratic president we have in this period, prior to the beginning of the 20th century, is Grover Cleveland. He won in 2 non-consecutive terms. He's the only president to do that, actually, to serve 2 non-consecutive terms. But the parties, for the most part, were pretty evenly balanced. And a result of that is that neither party really wanted to rock the boat too much. They didn't really support radical new ideas, in part because they wanted to appeal to the moderate middle. The elections would often tend to hinge over who could mobilize the middle to support their party, the handful of undecided voters, where they want to go. And so as a result, for most of this period, the two political parties look awfully similar to one another. The one big issue that does tend to factor into presidential election cycles becomes the tariff. And frankly, the Democratic and Republican parties can't even stay consistent on what side the tariff they're on. Sometimes Republicans are against it, sometimes they're for it, sometimes Democrats are against it, sometimes Democrats are for it. Yeah. Now, as far as the federal government is concerned, the presidential office remains pretty weak. Ever since the Congress regularly overrode vetoes from President Johnson during the era of Reconstruction, the office of the Oval Office remained pretty weak. Presidents there were basically placeholders, not really active participants in crafting legislation. That will change once we get to the Teddy Roosevelt administration in the 20th century, but the late 19th century, after the fall of Reconstruction, it's a period of reasonably forgettable presidents. Most legislative activity took place in Congress, and interestingly enough, the Supreme Court also played a fairly strong role in shaping what the laws of the country were going to look like. The Supreme Court made a number of rulings that were quite impactful in creating what we might call a legislative interstate marketplace. So when I say a legislative interstate marketplace, what I mean is that large firms that manufacture for large population bases don't like to deal with myriad different laws that often contradict one another. If you think of today, for example, and you think of auto manufacturing, California's auto laws are often stricter than other states. And so what most manufacturers do is they simply make for the California market, and then it's good enough for everyone else in the United States. At one point in the not too distant past, the state of Minnesota, the legislature there, was thinking about raising the requirement for ethanol in gasoline. They were going to raise the requirement to 20%. Auto manufacturers went to the Capitol and said, you just can't do that. Like, if you do that, we're just not going to sell cars in Minnesota, or if we do, all of your residents are going to violate their warranties as soon as they put a tank of gasoline in the car. Because they can't make for small markets. Businesses have to make for large marketplaces with lots of customers. That's how industrial production works. And the Supreme Court in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century too, plays an active role in ensuring that this legal interstate marketplace with relatively uniform laws between state boundaries can exist. One way in which they do that is knocking down state laws that could potentially create a more complicated legal landscape. One of those rulings is in the Chicago, Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Railway versus Minnesota. What happened is Minnesota, being an agrarian state, lots of farmers there. As we'll see when we get into the section on the west, lots of farmers are pretty angry at the railroads in the closing decades of the 19th century. What they really didn't like in particular is that railroads had a tendency to charge different prices for different customers. And often, really big customers that could pay lots of money got cheaper fares than smaller customers who couldn't pay as much money. You can imagine why people were very angry about that. And so they put pressure on their state legislature to do something about it. So the state legislature did. They commissioned a panel, and this special commission was going to review railway rates and make sure everything was fair, that nothing was being overcharged. Well, the railroad companies didn't like that very much, so they sued, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that this violated the 14th Amendment rights of this particular company and presumably other companies too, if Minnesota were to try and use this process for them. The Supreme Court asked, where's the court system? If somebody's violating a law, you take them to court, and we have a jury trial or a judge trial. There's no court here, though. All you have is this panel of people who are appointed by the legislature to decide, based upon their own guesswork, their own estimation, whether or not these rates are fair. And so the Supreme Court ruled in this case that the railroads were being denied real due process. So the ruling was that the states had certain limits on what they could do to railroads or manufacturers within their states because of the 14th Amendment. That the 14th Amendment protected certain rights and empowered the national government to stop states from infringing upon those rights. And at about the same time that the National Supreme Court is moving away from using the national government to protect the rights of the freed people of the South, the Supreme Court is moving toward using the 14th Amendment to limit the ability of states to regulate railroads or factories within their borders. Another classic example of this is a ruling in the early 20th century in which the Supreme Court said that states could not violate the right of workers to enter into contracts. What happened in New York was that what happened in New York is that a lot of workers put pressure on their state government to do something about the long working hours. State government responded by limiting the amount of work hours per week to 60 hours. So no more than 10 hours per day, 6 days per week. Well, this bakery in New York sued and said, well, how can the state government limit my employees' right to enter into whatever contract they want to enter into? If they want to sign a contract that obligates them to work 80 hours per week, how is it that the Supreme Court can come in here, or I'm sorry, not the Supreme Court, the state legislature can come in here and tell them they can't? So they sued, went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed that the 14th Amendment limited the ability of states to infringe upon the right of contract. Now, the 14th Amendment doesn't say anything about a right of contract, but it talks rather broadly and vaguely about the rights that individuals have and the ability of states to infringe upon those rights. And often the Supreme Court or other courts have had to interpret, well, what exactly does that mean? What are these rights specifically? What exactly were they talking about? And here, the Supreme Court is saying that Americans have a right to enter into a contract, and the state governments rather cannot infringe upon that right of individuals to enter into a contract. So over and over again, the tendency of the Supreme Court is to limit the ability of states to create legislation that would create a more complicated legal landscape in which factories would have to negotiate. Instead, what we get is a relatively uniform landscape where the laws are relatively similar from state to state, which large firms manufacturing for the entire national population really prefer and can sell more products that way. The Supreme Court also has a tendency to limit the ability of Congress to do much about this process of industrialization as well. Congress did create this law called the Sherman Antitrust Act, trying to prevent what we would call monopolization. Trust is a little more complicated. It's really an agreement between businesses to coordinate their efforts to try and increase the price of a product, increase their own profits. As it's interpreted by the Supreme Court, a trust could also be a labor organization. What do you have but a trust of workers getting together to manipulate wages for themselves? And so sometimes labor unions were ruled against because of the way in which they resembled trusts. And in 1895, the Supreme Court rules in such a way as to limit very narrowly the powers of Congress regarding economic regulation within the country. So if you look at the Constitution, Article 2 gives Congress power to regulate international trade, interstate trade, and commerce with the various American Indian nations. And based upon that power, Congress created this Sherman Antitrust Act. And the Antitrust Act was at least intended to deal with some of the problems of industrialization and the immense power that industrial production tended to give to a handful of individuals, to try and make sure that that monopolistic power did not grow too centralized. So in 1895, this American Sugar Refining Company tried to buy out a smaller sugar refining company in upstate New York called E.C. Knight. The U.S. government sued and said, no, you can't do that, that this would create an unfair trust, because through the process of buying this small sugar refining company, American Sugar Refining would control almost all of the refined sugar within the United States. And the Justice Department felt as though that was a trust. The Supreme Court ruled, however, that this falls outside of the bounds of Congress's regulatory power because E.C. Knight is a factory in upstate New York. It's not on the boundary between New York and, say, Pennsylvania. It's not a company that exists overseas. It's not a factory in another country. It is a factory within a state refining sugar. And because of that, it is intrastate commerce. It is commerce within the state, not commerce between the states. Supreme Court was not concerned about what happened to the sugar after it left the factory. The fact that they would put it on rail cars and ship it across the country was unimportant. What was important was that this sugar was being produced within a single state and thus did not fall within the regulatory powers of Congress. Now, this is an extremely narrow interpretation of interstate commerce that makes it very difficult for Congress to do much to regulate a lot of this industrial production. Unless it can be explicitly construed as interstate commerce, like transportation, for example, quite explicitly interstate. Once they left the shop floor, it could be interpreted as interstate because leaving. But the actual production being intrastate means that a lot of what's being done in the industrial era falls outside of the powers of Congress, according to the Supreme Court in 1895.